guys, it's Julesy, and let's get into another complex discussion within the African diaspora. Some of you like to call these the diaspora wars. Are you ready for it? I'm ready. Africans selling their own people, us, into slavery. And do African Americans, Afro-Caribbeans, and any of the modern day descendants of enslaved Africans in the Americas have the right to hold modern day Africans accountable? I'm Julesy, head smart brown girl in charge, and let's get into this and go ahead and thumbs up, because whether you like it, love it, or don't agree at all, wow, it's still always a great discussion. So subscribe if you're new here. Now, I've seen this sentiment bubbling over on Twitter and certain corners of YouTube, typically used to defend xenophobic sentiments African Americans are pushing against African immigrants in America. I do think it is worth interrogating this sentiment, because how else do you push back against xenophobia? It is estimated that 12.5 million Africans were shipped during the transatlantic slave trade, with about 10.5 million actually surviving the Middle Passage, that is, crossing across the Atlantics to the New World, as they would call it. And it's important to distinguish this as the transatlantic slave trade, in that European colonizers were the orchestrators of this era of slavery, because slavery historically has been going on in various iterations up into the modern day, as in like it's still actually happening. So the concept of enslaving people was not new to the various nations of West Africa before the white man arrived on their coast, because the conquest for power often comes through war and conquering. Historically, it has been noted that there was some form of slavery prior to the era we are referring to, but it was often used as a tool of judicial punishment, and people were not being put on boats and shipped across the Atlantic, which makes this era unique. So it is not entirely unfair nor unfactual to note that Africans kidnapped and enslaved other Africans, that the European colonizers were not the ones doing the initial kidnapping, but rather purchasing bodies to be resold from other Africans. But where we all fail is thinking of slavery, and particularly the transatlantic slave trade, as though it happened in a vacuum, where only one side reaped the torturous consequences while the other plundered and reaped the power and the wealth. First, we have to understand who were the Africans doing the kidnapping. As I said, enslavement has been happening in various iterations throughout lands, societies, countries for forever, because unfortunately it is a part of how countries or nations heighten their power. So it is not African individuals, rather warring tribes, nations, and kingdoms overtaking other tribes, nations, and kingdoms. The advent of slavery being a profitable economic ecosystem that buoyed private wealth with the arrival of the Europeans, slavery greatly disrupted entire kingdoms and tribes. Everyone that was kidnapped did not make it onto a slave ship. People migrated to avoid capture. Ethnic groups coalesced into each other to build more solid defenses against being kidnapped into slavery. Kidnapped peoples repatriated, whether they escaped the slave castles in Africa and settled on whatever land they could get to, or they came back on Marcus Garvey's boat 200 years later. The over 400 years of the transatlantic slave trade saw over 400 years of various forms of repatriation throughout the years. And maybe a few less years centered around the height of this era, where peoples or tribes wholesale moved to avoid capture. Don't let Kanye West have you out here messed up in the game thinking that people by choice walked into being slaves. And then you have to consider that the over 400 years of the slave trade was before country lines were drawn by the colonizers in the 1860s, as in the country lines that we now know of. Slaves weren't simply kidnapped from Nigeria, they were taken from the Bight of Benin, now parts of modern day Ghana, Benin, Togo, and Nigeria, or the Bight of Biafra, now parts of modern day Nigeria and Cameroon. To complicate even further, there's regions that were a part of the slave trade, like what's formerly known as the Pepper or Grain Coast, that's now modern day Liberia and part of Sierra Leone. So to inform you of some African political history here, both of these countries were founded by Western colonizers allowing former slaves to repatriate. And then in essence, because imperialism is always messy, they created a ruling class amongst the repatriated, mostly African American and Caribbean former slaves, that while participating in the same Western imperialism capitalism that enslaved us and therefore them, greatly stifled the local people who were already on the land. So with all that said, there's almost no way for you to go to a modern day African and know whether they are a descendant of someone who kidnapped Africans into slavery or a descendant of someone themselves kidnapped or in other ways harmed by the slave trade. And when it comes to the accounts of people who know their African families sold slaves, we should definitely accost that history and not gloss over it while allowing people to profit or be celebrated for the power they achieved on the backs of others. But you still cannot go up to any given African and claim that they or their family or their peoples are guilty of enslaving your ancestors. I understand the hostility in discussing this sort of conversation because I think of the historian and author Zora Neale Hurston and how she puts it. But the inescapable fact that stuck in my craw was my people had sold me and the white people had bought me. It impressed upon me the universal nature of greed and glory. Wow, I really am slipping on the brand and should have been wearing my Zora Neale Hurston shirt. She's a fave for a reason, because Hurston parsed through this sentiment as she interviews a survivor from the last slave ship brought to America, yes, very illegally, in 1860, Cujo Lewis. He details a journey none of us can imagine taking after being kidnapped, I believe at like the age of 19, from his community in a part of Yoruba land that is now modern day Benin, and brought to Alabama into American slavery, where along with other recent African slaves post-freedom, establishes the historic Africa town in the Mobile, Alabama area. Zora Neale Hurston interviewed him in 1927, and over 80 years later, this interview was finally published. Yes, in the year of 2018. As in this year, the interview was finally published. So if you want to continue this discussion and work through what do we do with this history, how do we move past this history, what does it really mean for either sides of our connectedness, I would highly suggest listening to Hurston's Barracoon on Audible. Hurston, an OG smart brown girl herself, a personal fave, as a historian and archivist, took care to write in the dialect of the people. Hearing the amalgamation of Cujo's English with his African dialect resonates better than simply reading it. It's reminded me that slavery is a deeply painful part of all our history within the diaspora, but that it didn't simply happen to others or just to us or to them. There's a way for us to tackle our history and be better from it rather than bitter, to be unified rather than broken. Follow my link, audible.com/Julesy, or text Julesy to 500-500 and use your first month free audiobook to download Barracoon, because that is absolutely what I did, and I would just suggest skimming on down to chapter 5, because that's where the story of Cujo actually starts, and we can discuss it from there. I am always getting asked about what am I reading, what would I suggest, can I update my current book list? Girl, Barracoon is one of my top 3 of 2018. Because when I think about how I educate myself or how I would encourage others to educate themselves and tackling these harder topics, storytelling is always my preferred point of entry. Hence why I love Zora Neale Hurston so much. This is what I would recommend to start reading to encourage critical thought on this topic. And while Barracoon isn't fiction, it's still very well done sort of storytelling, and I appreciate that it is based on fact and well-researched history, and yet still it provides an easier point of entry that can build upon this critical dialogue. Thank you to Audible for allowing me to get this video done. I've been looking for a way to have these deeper, heavier conversations. So head over to audible.com/Julesy or text Julesy to 500-500. Get your free 30-day trial on Audible, where you get 1 free audiobook and 2 free Audible originals.